Well, it's now time to bring you a first feature on the show today as we look at the state of the Nigerian economy under the administration of President Muhammadu Buhari. Now, the Nigerian economy in 2014 was growing steadily at about 6.5% until policy inconsistencies forced the economy into a self-inflicted recession in 2016. Now, the government responded with an economic recovery growth plan with the broad objectives of restoring growth, building a globally competitive economy, and also accelerating inclusive growth by investing in the Nigerian people from 2017 to 2021. Now, the plan promise was to enable stem the economic decline to deliver at least 7% growth by 2020, as all major macroeconomic indicators have deteriorated and continue to deteriorate. Now, in the first quarter of this year, the Nigerian economy recorded a paltry 0.5% growth rate in terms of GDP performance, while population was growing at about 3.5%. Inflation rate is slightly to 18.12% in April, down from the four-year high of 18.17% recorded in March this year. As unemployment and underemployment still hovers well over 50%, with monetary policy rates unchanged at 11.5%. Now, with the various monetary policy interventions and fiscal policy measures introduced by the government to help cushion the severity of the projected economic decline from last year, while the Economic Sustainability Plan, the 2021 Appropriation Act, and also changes introduced via the Finance Act 2020, are all expected to facilitate economic recovery and boost inclusive growth this year. Well, to now discuss much more on these and other issues, I have joining me live from our Abuja studios. He's a macroeconomic and public policy analyst, Professor Ken Ife. Good to have you on the show this afternoon.
Thank you very much for having me.
And a happy Democracy Day to you as well.
And you too. Thank you.
Now, let's start following the end of President Muhammadu Buhari's first term in office. Definitely, the second term implied that he had an extensive to-do list in terms of his second and final term to smoothen things. Now, right now, talking about infrastructure development, let's start from that. Looking at efforts by the federal government to ensure that we have improvement in infrastructure. You look at the commissioning of the Lagos-Ibadan rail line now, that received some cheering sentiment. How much of an agenda do you think we have to make in terms of funding infrastructure, looking at alternative sources of funding, and also understanding that our current budget size of borrowing cannot necessarily drive us as fast as where we want to reach in terms of infrastructure development?
Well, first of all, let me say that insecurity, the state of insecurity, is trying to crowd out all the areas of the economy and sectors of the economy where we have traction. And it's very unfortunate. And the infrastructure that you have started with is actually one good area. We have something to show to the world in Nigeria. If you remember, before this administration came in, virtually every highway was abandoned. You have contractors left sites complaining about payments and all sorts of things. And so when this administration came in, they didn't go to cancel contracts. They didn't go to award new contracts. They said, okay, get back to site and we'll give you what we have. And then they started paying and they all went back to site. So there's no highway in this country that you don't have work going on in it. And then secondly, if you look at the railway, which you have just mentioned, the last time there was investment in railway was in 1927. But now you can actually see traction in railway. We have many standard gauges on the western corridor, on the central corridor, on the east-west corridor, and then you have a refurbishment of the old gauge, narrow gauge on the eastern corridor. So what he says is that, and even to the point that we are moving into Niger to link with them to make sure we can compete on the export of their oil, because they now have oil. So not even the maritime sector is experiencing investment, because you have Lekki Deep Sea Port And then you have another 6 depots on the pipeline. You have Badagry, you have One, you have Ibaka. And there are other ones. Even Bayelsa wants one. And Bonny Deep Sea Port has been awarded. So there are many of them coming on stream. You go to the aviation, you have infrastructure improvements, and then new buildings for the international terminal in all the 5 international airports. So there is a lot of work going on, and I think it's about $800 million or that investment. So, but is that enough? It is not enough, but it is definitely a starting point. And then there are transition arrangements currently on to have an infrastructure company, PLC, which is already been capitalized with 1 trillion and is going to the go-to-market for 15 trillion naira. And that will be a game changer, because it is going to now take over much of this infrastructure that has been bogging down the central government. And then have more creative engagement of private sector in infrastructure development. So that is promising in that sense.
Most definitely, I share in your sentiments. It is a promising outlook, quite a green outlook, seeing the level of investment we are seeing in infrastructure across both the key sectors of the economy. You talked about aviation, looking at rail, road infrastructure, and much more. But still, I would want us to have the conversation around alternative funding now. Talking about investors, for example, investors are still sitting on the fence, to put things mildly. How do you think the state of the economy can convincingly put up a well-rounded investment portfolio to ensure that we have as much volume of investment being pumped in, despite security at hand, looking at the value of the naira dwindling, looking at borrowing concerns, and much more? How do we still incentivize or invite both public and foreign portfolio investors?
Well, that's it's very tough indeed, and it's really very challenging. Much of what is going on the forex regime, which is having a knock-on effect on inflation and investor confidence and all of that, are actually exogenous factors, because we don't have control over how much we earn in the oil. It depends on the production volume. It depends on the crude oil price. None of these two do we have control over. OPEC tells us what to produce. We have no choice to remain with OPEC than to abide. So these are all binding constraints. But then what we can do, which is make sure that we do much of the refining in Nigeria to conserve the foreign exchange, we haven't been able to do. So you find out that about 30% of the forex availability is also being consumed by using it to import the crude, export the crude, refine the crude outside, pay for it to come back, and then have the margin for the oil marketers. So it doesn't make much sense. So we need to conserve that oil, and because we don't have as much, over 80% of our manufacturing volume capacity depends on imported materials. And so we still have to give most of our foreign exchange to the manufacturing base. Otherwise, they go to the crude market, to the black market, and buy dollar at an excruciating cost, and simply pass it down to consumers, and inflation becomes uncontrollable. So in respect to that, you still have to say, how do you get more private sector to invest in infrastructure? The answer to that would be to wait and see, because the infrastructure company, PLC, is just going to be doing that. And making sure that PPP, and you can see that BPE has so many projects that they are bringing on stream. So to encourage private investors, particularly domestic investors, to invest in the infrastructure development is a task that must be done.
Exactly.
The circumstances are very difficult. The security situation makes it extremely difficult. But that is the way that the economy is heading, with the superstructures, and I can see that they will make progress sooner than later.
I share in your optimism. I like that point there. Sooner than later, we are going to see the light at the end of the tunnel. But talking about the light at the end of the tunnel, let's take, for example, the PIB. Looking at the energy sector now, the timeline for this year was April. We're still seeing a further delay. We're also looking at for the fact that we still have subsidies eaten into the 2021 budget. It's unaccounted for, looking at petrol subsidy, for example, as well. Dealing with market forces and then still have to manage the pinch that the average Nigerian would have to face. That's another issue. Take, for example, the power situation in the country. We've also had some collapses here and there. Power plants not in the best of shape, and then we've seen increase in tariff, and then government is saying, well, we have to have these increments to ensure we have improved infrastructure. As a whole, how do you see us sustaining this subsidy regime, which does not necessarily make the best of economic sense if we want to move forward as a country?
No, I'm opposed to subsidizing consumption. It doesn't matter what it is that you are consuming. You don't subsidize consumption. Because when you subsidize consumption, you are sacrificing your jobs here and paying for somebody else's job abroad to process and refine your crude. And so you can't do that. If you are doing it, it can be for a transitional period, but it doesn't make economic sense. Now, to come and also subsidize the petroleum product, again, it doesn't make sense, to be honest with you. And now you are going to say to the governors, go back empty-handed. They have an economy to run. They are running half of the economy of this country, the economy of this country. So we have to get out of this subsidy regime. And however gradual it is, it has to be done as speedily as possible. Then coming back to power, power is a binding constraint on our development. And it affects all factors of production. It affects all sectors of production, even services. And you can't have the level of epileptic power supply that we have because we continue to delay taking power to the mass market by investing on alternative energy sources and renewable energy sources in a way that gives every person a chance to contribute. At the moment, private sector are producing through diesel and generator 3 times more power than our economy. And the Manufacturers Association website tells us that 77% of their membership find power as the biggest constraint. And we also know that power accounts for at least 30% of the input cost. All these will crash if we allow private sector to take power to the mass market, produce the power that they can with solar, and then you take some of them into the grid, then remove the misalignments on the power sector configuration by bringing in end-to-end investors. And I'm glad that Siemens is coming in on that basis. So there are so many loopholes in the system that are being corrected, but it's just taking time. It's just taking time, but we know that in the next 2-3 years there may be more stability on the network than we have seen so far.
Prof, now let's also look at the Nigerian economy a little more with a different perspective towards the GDP growth we've seen, 0.51%. We're still expecting figures as well for the second quarter of this year, and everyone is optimistic that we are going to see also a reversal in terms of recessionary pressures. And we're also seeing population growth rate growing at about 3.5%. Inflation as also is stepping a little bit of brakes in terms of how much of a steep ride we have, now 18.12%, and unemployment rates now going by the indices or the dynamics of working with big data. Government really has to do much more in terms of working with data. How disappointing is it, and how critical do you think we need to have a population census? We need to see government parastatals work much more aggressively with data, because at the end of the day, there is no developmental agenda that can bear the fruits or desired results if we don't have the data or the real-time figures that reflect what's happening on ground. How do we work around data this time around and ensure that we have development reach the masses?
Is doing excellently well. They're doing well on their data, and they're very regular. We have monthly statistics on a range of indicators. There will always be room for improvement, without a doubt. But I have a lot of confidence on the National Bureau of Statistics. And even central bank also relies on their statistics to a huge extent. But let me come to the three parameters, macroeconomic parameters you mentioned. Now, we have seen some respite on inflation, and I just hope that it will keep steady.
That's the hope.
But it's not by any means, a closed deal. But also the unemployment rate is just disastrous. But there is a lot of effort to deal with the worst case scenarios, because we have people that are below poverty line and are receiving palliatives, and we have a lot of government works programs, but they're not enough to deal with the size of the challenge. So we need to go back to the private sector, because MSME account for over 90% of our jobs in the economy. And so however we're able to get diffusion of credit, microcredit to them, will take us a long way in improving the employment. So that is where I see my hope. You can see some traction in what the CBN is doing in Ako Borrowers program, getting 3 million farmers to access money, and then they are now producing more food. So that is helpful, but we need to have more. We've also seen National Microfinance Bank disburse over 90%, 94% of the people that have received microcredit, and disbursed 55% of all the microcredit that has been given quite recently in the last 1-2 years. So you have seen there's traction there, but we need more. We really need more, because the numbers are staggering. Then you come to macroeconomic growth. Again, there's a respite there, with a movement from 0.11 to 0.55. So we've seen some. We just hope that it will go to about 1% or more in the next quarter. In the next quarter, and it is not impossible. Which is very possible that we'll go there. After all, there are projections that we will close in at around 2.5 by the end of the year. And I cannot say that the worst is over, but there is light in the end of the tunnel.
Let's also look at poverty reduction initiatives by the government as well. Like you've rightly mentioned, there are some initiatives to ensure that we have increased investment in agriculture, manufacturing, looking at the ICT space and much more. But job creation has to be a little faster than what we are doing at this point in time. Like you said, much more needs to be done in order to facilitate economic recovery and also have a robust, inclusive growth for this year. But the question is, banks have gotten to that point where it's a little bit still difficult to stretch as much as possible to ensure that we have access to credit. Government also wants to do more, but is also stifled by the hand as to how much it can really do in terms of expanding the credit base to the masses so that we can have much more jobs and businesses staying afloat. How do you think we're going to be able to meander through this, especially as we still have the impact of the COVID-19 still railing on, and government just has to beat or jump over the hurdles created so far?
I think the government has done well, actually, on tackling the recession caused by the COVID pandemic. Because what we saw was an orchestrated response, qualitative response from fiscal and monetary authorities, shaking hands and addressing all aspects of the output and consumption. So both of them enabled us to escape immediately with a sharp big V-curve within 1 quarter. So we did ask them to consolidate. Then the second one is that you have seen how technology is being used by the central bank to ease access to finance. They're using biometric technology with the biometric bank verification number, and they're using satellite geomapping to map the 1 hectare per farmer, so that they can actually see the 1 hectare, and then they can verify that a human being is taking this money, and then they have a legal framework that allows them to claw back any money from any account of the beneficiary. So which means that you can run, but you cannot hide. So all of these are using technology to create more diffusion of finance to the base of our economic pyramid. Obviously, we need more. We need more to go to. We have sorted it out in agriculture, but we need to expand the value chains and then expand the catchment to all parts of the country, like especially the southern part of the country, and then more value chains, particularly the export value chains, Because the moment you have export anchors, then they can act on hibiscus, ginger, all those products, including solid minerals, gold and platinum, all those, they can act on all those and head them out to export. And we have a lot of exportable materials. We have 44 minerals, and we have this project of one product, one state, which is being led by the NEPC. But they need to work within the framework of a funding framework like anchor borrowers that has identified export anchors, and then they can build the quality infrastructure to take it from farm level through process level to export level. Then we can have diversity of export revenue that can challenge the dominance of petrodollar.
And then also linking this conversation now to the current value of the naira. How do you see things playing out? We are very careful with the language of naira devaluation, but at the end of the day, the competition of the naira against the greenback or other global currencies still raise some concern. The value of the naira in hand does not necessarily weigh as much. Your thoughts?
Yeah, the issue of the currency is just beyond anybody, because we have no control on the revenue, forex revenue. The forex revenue is 90% is dependent on oil. We have no control on those prices of those oil. We have no control over the volume that we produce. So what you have control over is demand management. And if you are going to go tougher on demand management, because I know in 2016 and 17, CBN restricted 34 items from demanding forex. They can do more. We can cause the shift. We can cause a seismic shift in the demand for forex by the oil refining community, who is using a lot of this money to pay for crude and refining, when we have 75 licenses for people to do modular refineries. And of course, we are all anxiously waiting for Dangote refinery to come and start and make a big difference in this large hole. But until we get to a point where we are diversifying that source of forex, maybe by intensifying the yuan deal with China, intensifying it so that we have less recourse to dollar. And then also realize that some people are also hoarding dollars. There's a lot of things going on the dollar. And I also know that the central bank is interested in gold, purchasing our gold, refining them in Turkey and bringing them back to diversify our gold reserves, our forex reserves. So some of all these efforts, they take time, but they are the right moves in the right direction to reduce the tension on the forex regime, because that is knocking every aspect of the economy. Of course, insecurity is another one that we have very little control over.
Prof, wrapping up our conversation now, I would like to have your forecast. How green do you see the Nigerian economy as we gradually enter into the remaining parts of this year?
Well, I think, look, if you look at the oil price now, it's $73 per barrel. And I would have thought that with an increasing price of crude, we should have had more benefit on revenue. But when you are using that revenue to export the crude and refine it and bring it back, it just doesn't make sense. All you now have is that the increase in crude price to $73, which would have benefited us and have more accretion to our crude oil reserve, excess crude account, and then to forex reserve. We're just burning all this, and they don't have much fun. And then in fact, the mere fact that you still export them and refine them means that the end price of selling this petroleum to the people who need it is still going to continue to increase. So, it's a no-brainer. This thing doesn't make sense to me. Why we are following this path, it doesn't make sense.
Well, we'll continue to keep our fingers crossed, looking at government's policy direction, looking at conversations around cleaner energy, looking at utilizing oil and gas reserves that we have in country, stabilizing the naira, stabilizing the economy, ensuring that we have a populace that is well employed, utilizing our human resource. All of these are very, very important conversations that we have to have. Thank you very much for your time on the show today, Professor Ken Ife. It's been a pleasure speaking with you. And once again, a happy Democracy Day. We'll continue to fly very high the Nigerian flag and hope that one day we'll be very proud of the Nigerian nation and they will see things get better. Thank you for your time on the show once again.